Hello, everyone. I'm Ernie Humphrey, the CEO of Treasury Webinars. I would like to thank everyone for taking the time to join us for our webinar today, Payments Fraud, 10 Reasons It Deserves Your Attention. Before we get started, I want to convey that I hope everyone out there is safe and healthy, and I hope that your families are safe and healthy as well. We will be addressing the coronavirus during our presentation today, but we also realize that we might need a break from all the coronavirus news. And one thing that we are going to do today for you is we are going to make you smile, because everyone can use a smile today, right? So first of all, I would like to thank our webinar partner today, TIS, whose commitment to thought leadership and their support for the Treasury and finance professions helps us make this webinar possible. As complexities and expectations of accounts payable and payments continue to rise, finance organizations are required to support diverse electronic payment methods, initiate riskier cross-border transactions, and take on dynamic tax compliance and financial reporting, all while operating with a smaller operational footprint, and now in a remote environment. Manual processes in this environment are creating dangerous gaps in maintaining and strengthening robust financial controls. The risk is substantial. Obviously, once the money leaves your bank account, chances are slim to none it's going to come back. And believe me, I know. I was a Treasury manager for several years. Today, we will review the key results of the 2019 AFP Payments, Frauds, and Controls Survey and another great study from our friends at Strategic Treasurer, the 2020 Treasury Fraud and Controls Global Survey. We'll also share best practices of companies that are payment risk strategies using to mitigate and even eliminate payments risk exposures. Before we delve into the content, I'm going to offer a few quick words about Treasury webinars, cover a few housekeeping items, cover our learning objectives as they offer the pillars of our value proposition for you in investing an hour of your valuable time today. And I'm going to introduce and welcome my esteemed speaking partner for today's webinar, John Paquette. First, about Treasury webinars. We offer webinars designed to empower Treasury, accounts payable, and accounts receivable success at companies of all sizes across all industries. We only do what we do best, which is actually now virtual events. More on that later. Now for the exciting housekeeping items. For any of you interested in receiving CTP credit for today's webinar, you'll have to answer all of our polling questions, remain on for the duration of the webinar, and complete the post-webinar survey, which will launch immediately following the conclusion of our webinar today. If you have any questions regarding CTP credits or would like a copy of today's presentation, please send an email to Ernie@treasurywebinars.com. Again, that's Ernie@treasurywebinars.com. Along the same lines, we have a lot of content to deliver to you, so please focus on our color commentary, and we're happy to send you the slides. We'd like to hear from you today, and we can take your questions at any time in the questions area of your GoToWebinar control panel. Fear not, if we do not get to your questions today, we will follow up with you directly after the webinar. Finally, we appreciate everyone's consideration in taking a short survey at the end of the webinar today, as we always strive to improve the ROI we offer our attendees for their valuable time. Now, our learning objectives. After the webinar, we want you to be able to understand current trends in payments fraud activity, and we'll also add trends that are going to be coming because of the environment that we're in right now. We want you to be able to identify current and emerging payments risk exposures at your company and offer you specific tactics to leverage or in eliminating and or mitigating payments risk exposures at your company. Those are three objectives, but they are very high and lofty objectives. So that is one of the reasons why I invited my esteemed speaking partner to help me today. So speaking of my esteemed speaking partner, it is my pleasure to welcome John Paquette to the webinar. He's a senior finance expert with TIS. In his role, he assists clients and prospective clients in finding the best use of technology that TIS offers to solve their organizational challenges. Prior to joining TIS, John held various finance and treasury positions in U.S.-based organizations. Most recently, John held the role of the Senior Director of Treasury for a large healthcare organization that I know very well, because I used to collaborate with the treasurer there myself. John holds a BA in economics from Mercer College and an MBA from the Carroll School of Management at Boston College. I just realized that you have two economists on the webinar today, so please bear with us. John, it's a pleasure to have you on the webinar, and welcome to the webinar today, John.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ernie. Thanks for having me, and excited to be here.
Yeah, so one of the things I want to note is John and I are going to try and make this webinar a lot more conversational. So John and I are both longtime Treasury professionals, and so we really want you to understand that we really have faced these challenges ourselves over many years, and we're both still extremely plugged in into what's going on. And so on that note, please ask us your questions here during the webinar as well. So first of all, our agenda, how are we going to accomplish our objectives, which I don't often see in a webinar. We're going to talk a little coronavirus, and so we'll kind of give you a little context of what's coming, and then just give you some advice on things that you might want to pay more attention to, and then of course offer ourselves, if you want to have conversations after the webinar, if you want more context around how these issues might be changing or emerging issues that might be caused as we all work in this new remote environment. So we'll talk about payments fraud is rampant. I don't think that's news to anyone, but it's interesting to look at these survey results, which are absolutely fascinating. And so we're sharing some results. We have the hyperlinks to both of the survey results. And so just a quick note, AFP has amazing content around payments fraud and many other things, and so does Strategic Treasury, so they have amazing content as well. So not only on payments fraud, but both organizations do a fantastic job in supporting the Treasury profession. So we'll talk about how did fraud risk exposure mitigation, and then I'll bring John in to take over for a while and talk about internal payment risk exposure. We'll do a little bit of a deeper dive, and then we'll wrap things up with some payments risk mitigation, the bottom line, then we'll offer you some additional resources. So we're not going to be able to answer all of your problems, address all your issues that you might face or will face, but we're going to help you ask the right questions, get access to the right resources, connect with your peers and your service providers, right, to get some assistance in helping you protect your company's assets. And so let's talk a little bit about coronavirus. And I know it's kind of overwhelming for some people that work remotely. If you've never worked remotely, I've worked remotely for the past 10 years. So that's kind of an adjustment, right? And so as we're making that adjustment, we need to make sure that we're really cognizant of, in this remote environment, what does that do, right, to the way that we do business in Treasury? And in my mind, the most important thing we do is that we protect our company's assets, right, and make sure that we're able to move money and keep the money coming in and going out as it needs to. And so one of the things that we're starting to see more attention to is business continuity plans. But unfortunately, some of the Treasury Department's continuity plans, they don't really enable them to fully maintain their control. And so we need to see what it is that we can do to best address those concerns. And this may seem kind of strange, but it's actually a good time, right, to look at investing in technology, because this remote environment's not going away. And so those exposures are coming. And so it might be an opportunity for you to have that value proposition. So John, let me bring you in here. Are you getting more questions about business continuity plans on them? What are you kind of seeing lately?
Yeah, so I think so for sure. Like you mentioned, a lot of people are getting used to working from home for the first time, but also a lot of business continuity plans are really being put to the test right now, right? So, based on what we're hearing, a lot of organizations are really, getting to test whether or not they have access to the same systems that they rely on a day-to-day basis to complete certain Treasury functions, and noticing some gaps and things. So a lot of challenges that we're hearing about now from individuals within the industry.
Great, thanks, John. Yeah, and so kind of along the same lines, in some instances, you're actually forced, right, to abandon your standardized and automated process. But the key thing to do is when you're making these changes, do it in a most educated way possible. And so look at these changes, understand what risk that you're undertaking, and you want to communicate that, right? You want to make sure that everyone involved in the payments process understands things are changing, and there are certain areas where you might have to have a more heightened awareness than normal, and so make sure the communication is open. And so if your company doesn't have a vehicle for that open communication, there's tools like Zoom, GoToMeeting. I recently have started using a collaboration tool called Slack. So as we abandon these processes, we need to make sure that we are able not only to communicate with our internal staff in real time, right? We also need to make sure that we have the ability to communicate with our service partners, our banks, right? And so we make sure business as usual doesn't get disrupted. And then, of course, this is a really important point, which you might not think about, right? Because all these changes are coming. The other thing is you might be managing people remotely, right? That's a completely different animal. But fraudsters are aware of what's going on, and they're looking to exploit the process vulnerabilities. We'll talk about that, and then we'll talk about how to be on high alert. So John, let me bring you in here again. So excuse me. In regards to your second point, are there any like fraud risk that you see that are emerging from this remote environment that you think many companies are facing now that you might just want to point out so people are taking a look in those areas?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, a lot of organizations have worked really hard to put in place good Treasury processes now. A lot of straight through processing, that really limits the ability for files to be manipulated or, for really any type of fraud to be introduced into the process. But as they're moving into this remote work environment, it seems like it's harder to maintain those processes, right? And organizations are moving more towards some manual processes in the interim, like file uploads and downloads by individuals within the organization, even the utilization of e-banking tools more frequently than they would have been. So obviously, as you move towards these more manual processes, you open up the door for a lot of fraud to be introduced. And anything that is sort of outside what your organization views as its sort of standardized process, can be exploited by fraudsters as well as they look for sort of, abnormal times like these to introduce fraud attempts.
Yeah, great. Just to dovetail off that a little bit, a few great points. One that I'll touch on is just like in Treasury, right? Some of us might not be in the cloud on ERPs, and we might be pushing files, right, from the ERP, pushing and pulling files. So those can obviously cause some challenges for us. So we kind of need to see, right, what's going to happen, right? If we have issues with that ERP file, maybe we're pushing out an ACH file, maybe we're pushing out a check run. So what are we going to be able to do? Maybe we need to have someone on premise. How do we do that? How do we do that in a way that makes sense for everyone? So I think it's just important that we're thinking outside the box. The other thing is, I would encourage you to engage, right, the people in your organization that manage risk or control of your insurance policies, maybe your internal auditors, and just let them know, right, that these things are going to be occurring. And so maybe there's going to be audit questions, right, about what did we do during the crisis. So let's all be ready, right, to maintain those audit trails. I think that's going to be incredibly important. And this next slide, I think this is great. This is a slide that John created for me. So John, why don't I let you walk us through this slide since you put this together?
Right, yeah. So on the left side here, we have sort of what I was mentioning before in terms of organizations, really having secure payment processes in place, or a lot of organizations in most places. But they're heavily technology reliant, right? In terms of individuals that are really sort of hands off in the process. In this case, this sort of replicates what a straight through process would look like in terms of files coming out of the ERP systems or Treasury applications, or really any application within the IT landscape that has a payment creation ability. In turns, most of those transactions are routed directly to the banks. No real opportunity for fraud to be introduced into that process at all. Likewise, most organizations have in place really clear-cut approval processes and standardized processes for how those payment files need to be created and sent to the banks that really help to keep processes overall in control, right? So it's a combination of good internal processes, good internal controls, and then technology that really backstops the whole the whole process. As you move to the right side here, you see this is what we're seeing a lot of organizations need to move to, right? They lose that technology infrastructure, or even certain components of it that in turn make them need to resort to manual processes. Maybe you're receiving approvals through email more frequently than you normally would. You're logging into e-banking portals, resorting to really what are sort of manual methods for conducting Treasury processes, right? And so as you move away from this technology backstop process, and you eliminate that component of standardization that's so important in creating control for the organization, that's where the fraud risk really comes in, right? That's where you have the ability to really be exploited from a fraud standpoint. And for that reason, we're really advising, the organizations that we talk to be on high alert for any sort of fraud attempts during these times.
No, that's great. And I love this slide. And I think if I was a Treasury manager, I would actually recreate this slide for my company and just see where were we at before, right? Where are we at now? And then what are those exposures? And then how can we possibly mitigate these exposures? So let's just kind of put some context around this, just some current news. It's actually disturbing. Actually, it adds some context. I think it's rather engaging and compelling. So if you just look at coronavirus, domains registered weekly, and so you start to see the fraudsters are really like they're licking their chops out there, right? And so we've got the coronavirus domains, and so here's a specific phishing campaign, telling people go through the attached documents. So they're trying to get people from a doctor, right? Hey, you need to look at these things to help protect your employees. So they're playing on your, hey, well, how do I protect my employees? I don't know what to do. You don't know what to do, so I'm going to send you an attachment and you're going to open it. And so we'll talk about this later in the presentation for a bit, but you really need to educate your folks, right, on email best practices, fraud practices, things that are going to happen. Here's one that I have almost fell for myself. I'll be honest. There's an app called Coronavirus. Allows you to look at the virus spread rate so we can all get dialed into this following coronavirus. And so we need to be careful. And then I have a source down here where there's a lot of other recent scams. And so it's really good to just, get plugged in a little bit more, that your time at home. Let's see what's going on here. There's a lot of resources for the fraud. So let's make sure we're on top of that, and let's educate, right, our folks. Everyone involved in the payments process, we should have meetings, right, on what's going on there. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. And so let's go ahead and take a look at the coronavirus. So some new risk exposures. Here's another common fraud thing that we have. So we've got the World Health Organizations, and so it looks really real. So Dr. Trendos, so you got to tell people they have to be careful. And then we've got some other things as well over here. So just some more hyperlinks. So if you'd like a copy of the presentation, again, please just let me know. And so let's take a look at the battlefield here. And I love this graphic from my friends at Strategic Treasury, and it really shows like the battlefield, right? So what's going on, things that you can do, and things that you want to assess kind of right where you're at now, and what you can do in that environment. But you look at, this is their 2019 Treasury Fraud and Control Survey. So both these reports are really insightful, but it just gives you an idea of kind of things that you can do, right? Things people are doing, sources of fraud, your data theft, your business email compromise scan, you got your systems level fraud, and then these are things that we can do, right, to mitigate that. And this gives us a cool picture of the environment. So we got user monitoring, and we'll talk about all these, but this just kind of is if you're a visual person, this is really, I think it's a really compelling slide. So let's go ahead. I know you are all want to have a polling question, right? So let's go ahead and launch our first polling question. Just asking you to share with us over the past 12 months if your company has experienced attempted fraud in any of the following areas. So you can choose more than one area. Hopefully you don't have to. Checks, wires, ACH debit or ACH credit. So those may come via a BEC scam, corporate commercial credit cards, or none of the above, which we hope you all are on none of the above. So I'm going to go ahead and leave the polling question up for another few seconds or so, and then we're going to go ahead and we're going to take a quick peek at the results here, see if there's anything surprising, and then we'll keep these results in mind, right, as we start to look at the results from the two great surveys that we mentioned earlier, and then we'll see if John has any thoughts. So I'm going to go ahead and leave the polling question up for another 5 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, let's go, people. I know you want your CTP credits. I'll give you about 5 more seconds. Let's get up to 80 or 90% votes. I want everyone to vote, obviously. So I sincerely appreciate your consideration. Willing to share, this is a confidential survey, so please let us know. Okay, 3, 2, 1. Okay, let's go ahead and take a quick peek. And what we see, the top category, I'm not surprised, we have 46% in checks. I think what we'll see in these strategic treasurer surveys is that Actually, wires are catching up or even past checks, which is surprising. But the key point that I like to tell people is checks are still, in general, the most common source of fraud. So everybody still writes checks, and there's reasons to do that. So we got to be diligent. But we see that there's a spread, and unfortunately, some people have experienced all of these. 26%, none of the above, and I certainly hope that that's the case. But you also need to be cognizant that there may have been fraud going on that you're not aware of. And so we'll talk about that a little later. Hey, John, is there anything that sticks out to you here at all?
No, like you said, I think we'd expect check fraud attempts to be the highest, just because that payment instrument, and it's historically sort of been the easiest to exploit for fraudsters. Like you mentioned, I would expect wires to be catching up quickly in terms of overall fraud attempts, just because of how much business email compromise attempts seem to be out there in the Treasury world right now. I think the previous slide said nearly 80% of organizations have experienced this in some respect. Obviously not all of those having an actual loss, but I think that overall wire fraud attempts are probably starting to pick up quite a bit.
All right, perfect, thank you. Yeah, so I mean, what you'll see is the 2019, first we'll look at the AFP Payments, Frauds, and Controls Survey. I think we'll be seeing the 2020 results here in the next couple months. I think it usually comes out in May. Again, the hyperlinks there gives you much more context. I read this every year. I used to get a preview of it when I worked at AFP, so I strongly encourage you. A lot of great content there. So again, it's just payments fraud is rampant. I don't think it's surprising, but it's interesting to see the trend. I think it's disturbing, maybe not interesting, but in 2013, right? Of course, it depends on the people that respond to the survey, but we were down at 60%. And just look at this trend. I mean, 82%. Right, of people. And so from our survey, we had 74% of you have experienced fraud, 82%. So it's important to everyone. And then changes in the incidence of payments fraud. And so about the same, more, right? 34%. Unfortunately, I expect that number to go up. So I always think it's really interesting to really present the survey results, because sometimes people don't know the surveys are out there. It's interesting to see where you compare, and then really what's going on out there in a very concise manner, and then get some insights, right, from some of us that are Treasury experts ourselves, as well as you in the audience. So let's go ahead and switch over to our survey results from our friends at Strategic Treasure. Again, amazing content. Craig Jeffrey, amazing speaker as well. Great podcast. So I encourage you to check out that website as well. So have you experienced fraud in the last 12 months? And so a little bit lower incidence numbers, right? 53% are unsure. So a little bit more encouraging. But this is, again, look at this, 76% believe that the threat of fraud has increased from the past year, right? And these are a little bit more recent survey results from Craig and his team. And corporates saw an increase in fraud attempts over a 3-year period, 50%. So again, payments fraud is rampant. It's on the rise. I think we all see that it's something that deserves our attention. However, sometimes this is good information to share, right? Maybe you're talking about where you're going to focus some of your valuable time in Treasury. Well, we need to pay attention to payments fraud. I really want to get some time with everyone involved in payments, right? We need to have a lunch meeting, a webinar. We need to have that employee education in place, because to me, that's one of the key things. Every time I talk about payments fraud, I say education, it probably costs the least and it can have the most impact. Let people know how they're impacting fraud, right? Best practices, but also let them know that you're watching, right? You can't, we got all these controls in place. You're not going to be able to get away with it. So we're watching, and there are consequences, and teach people how to see things that don't look right. And then when we have a potential incident, that goes to our fraud response team. So percent of organizations, again, attempted or actual payments fraud, kind of the same thing that we saw from Strategic Treasurer, but doing it by segmenting by company size. The thing that I see here is that it doesn't matter like what your company size is. So even if you're a small company, you might think, well, that's not really relevant, right, to me. And also, company size doesn't always correlate with complexity and payments exposure. So as you start to move money across countries, as you have more partners that are overseas, and so there are many things that can have your company exposed to fraud risk exposures, and it's not just your size, it can be industry specific. So where you stand depends on where you sit. And so it's good to have your pulse on what the surveys say, but also your fellow Treasury colleagues listening to these webinars, and when we're able to, right, go to live events again. Of course, we can all look to virtual conferences like the one that I'll be delivering in the fall, where we can collaborate with our peers. We can collaborate with our peers on LinkedIn. So one key point I want to dovetail off on here is, even in this remote environment, don't feel like that you don't have access to the resources you need. You don't have access to the colleagues you need. Don't feel like you don't have access to the peers that you need. And if you're feeling that way, please send me an email or reach out to me on LinkedIn, and I think I can point you in the right direction. And so let's take another look here from, again, Strategic Treasurer. Again, the hyperlinks there. Happy to share the presentation with you. And then I think Craig also has a webinar where he goes in detail with the survey results, which is also really great. So what are you spending plans for Treasury fraud? So I'm glad to see that we're paying some attention to that. So spend more or significantly more. I'm glad to see that at 19%. I'd like to see it higher. In 2017, we had a big spike here. So it'd be interesting if I were to go back and look at some of the results from 2016, see what was spiking there. So I'd like to see this number going up. Top areas of spend, so this is really cool. Specific advice, right, for where you should focus. Be business email compromise, and part of that, I believe, should be employee education, transaction fraud, transaction controls, and bank reconciliation. Hey, John, let me bring you back in here. Everyone's tired of hearing me speak. So is there anything on this slide that jumps out to you? I think this is a really interesting slide. Anything jump out, or any context you want to add with what you're seeing?
You know, I think I am a little bit surprised to see the plan level of spend drop a bit here, just because, you know, the level of fraud and the sophistication of the fraud attempts is growing every single day. So that's a little surprising on my side, but like you said, maybe it'd be interesting to see the survey results from probably that 2017 survey here as well. But overall, you know, the emphasis on business email compromise doesn't surprise me at all. I know that that's a big area of focus. That a lot of organizations are looking to mitigate the risk there as well. So, you know, that seems to align with what we're seeing as well.
Okay, great. So let me ask you this question. So from the conversations that you're having and your customers and your conversations with your colleagues, so you have clients all across the globe. Do you think that there are areas, like, do you think that business email compromise seems to be the place that you think might need the most attention, or is there another area on here that you think from what you're seeing might even be lower hanging fruit where people could really mitigate that risk?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's a big area of focus just because it's the most common fraud attempt most organizations see. But I think overall, you know, like you mentioned, the topics of education, just employee education, and even internal controls and processes and things like that too are easy for people to sort of think through and you know, put in place better practices there to you know, combat some of these fraud attempts as well too. So, you know, I think on our side what we're seeing is, you know, just thinking through these controls and the way that transactions are approved and authorized within organizations can be low-hanging fruit in terms of, you know, revisiting your policies and, like you mentioned, the education aspect for all employees involved.
Great, thanks, John. Just to make this point, hit it home again on the remote environment that we're seeing. And so obviously what John said was great. The BEC has been a problem, and they're getting even more crafty, right, with this remote environment. So that's where we want to double down. And transaction controls are where we want to double down. Again, let's make sure that we have the separation of duties and that audit trail. So let's think about that if we haven't done that yet. I mean, just mapping the payments process out again, end to end, right? What do we have now? What are we supposed to be doing, right? What are we able to do in our remote environment? And then how do we marry those as much as possible? And let's not be afraid to look at investing in technology right now to help us fill that gap. And it can be, the implementation times are incredibly faster than you might think. So I wouldn't take that off the table. So let's take a look at these risk exposures. Let's pivot back. Let's take a look at another Strategic Treasurer survey for 2019. the early survey, some other interesting, susceptible to fraudulent attacks. I think this is interesting. I think sometimes we don't have a broad enough perspective. And so if you've never really been in the weeds of payments, and it's really hard to comprehend the amount of people, processes, and systems that are involved in departments. So 90% AP, 64 Treasury, payroll, procurement, AR, and then which segment of your partner network, right, do you think you might have some exposure on? And so on the right, this tells me that we want to make sure that we understand, right, the fraud controls of our partners, what kind of certifications do they have in place. But then again, this might make you think, I never thought about payroll. I never thought about procurement. I never thought about accounts receivable. So on the left side here, John, any thoughts on the top 5 choices there, and one that you think people might most often overlook in thinking about this?
Yeah, no, I think that AP and Treasury are 2 obvious ones, right? Because they're processing the largest volume of transactions overall. So we're obviously going to have the highest fraud risk, particularly the AP department, which is, way out ahead here in this poll here as well. But, I think it is important to think about this procurement process as well here, your supplier onboarding process, even the next on the right-hand side here, they mentioned the suppliers and vendors are susceptible to fraudulent attacks as well, right? So if a supplier's network is compromised, something changes in the payment instructions, there's risk that an organization would process a fraudulent payment on that side as well. So I think, the procurement process, the supplier onboarding process is really a key component as well in organizations, making sure that they have good fraud protection in place too.
All right. Thank you so much, John. Let me go ahead and launch our next polling questions. And so I don't think I've been formal about this, but hopefully you can see that I've been trying to frame your exposure mitigation. What you're looking for is there are areas, and these may overlap. You have internal exposures, right? Your people and your systems, your external exposures, right? Your people and your systems, and then your technology itself. And so just asking you to share with me of those 3, which one do you feel is relative to your payment risk exposures, and we might be seeing more technology exposures given the coronavirus. So it'd be interesting to see what we have. So in order to be mindful of our time, and I'm going to warn you, we have a lot of content on slides we might not get through, but I thought it was extremely important that we really bring coronavirus in here, and I'm really enjoying the conversation that I'm having with John back and forth. I think we could talk for 3 or 4 hours on this slide deck, so we'll be mindful of our time. But let me go ahead and give you the 5-second countdown, then we'll take a quick peek at the results, and then we'll get back to some more survey results. Again, we'll move a little bit more rapidly through those results. Again, I can give you the slides and the links to those surveys. Let's go ahead and close the polling question. Let's go ahead and look here. External exposures, 13%, 55% external, 32% technology. Here's what I'm going to tell my audience. We should have more people on the internal exposure side. So I think when we start to look at the survey, it's actually the internal exposures, which are even more prevalent than the external exposures, and then the technology exposures. Those are things that we can address, and those are changing. So John, does this surprise you at all?
I think it does a little bit for the same reason that you mentioned before, because the internal exposures, basically how much you've really locked down your payment process in terms of, the approval process, the multiple controls in place to really secure that process. That can actually help to combat, I think, a lot of the external exposures and the technology exposures as well. So I think it's an important area for organizations to focus on. It's great if most organizations feel they have sufficient controls in place there as well, but I think the hope would be that it's not being overlooked, like you mentioned as well.
Yeah, and I think in all fairness, I mean, the surveys are designed, but I think when we really talk about the results, I think we focus a little bit too much on the external, right, types of fraud, and we feel like we can have more of an impact in helping people control that. My opinion is, what I've been trying to talk a lot more about the last few years is that I think we can help on the internal exposures. And like we both said, the good news is that you can do that through education in addition to investing in technology. And so just some more, we talked about, right, the payments fraud sources. So already kind of talked about that and how checks are still out in front. This is interesting, some more survey results. From Craig, and we talked about, here's more specific types of fraud. So if you want to dive down, right, a little bit deeper, We have BEC fraud and cyber fraud, and so Craig's getting a little bit more detailed, which is really cool within those categories. So interesting. Maybe you take a look at the slides afterwards and see if you want to learn any more about any of these types of fraud. Again, we're happy to have a conversation with you, and I know that Craig has some great detail on Strategic Treasurer site. And these are, I call them fraud winners. I love Craig has a good sense of humor like me. Oh, BEC, I'm sorry, I've been using this. It's business email compromise. I've been throwing that term around. I don't know if it's as common as I think. So largest number of losses from Craig's survey, BEC, right, as John mentioned. Most attempts, BEC, right, which is surprising. A little bit different than the AFP, and this might be due to the more recent data. Most surprising, check fraud, right? This blows my mind, right? From Craig's data, dropped down from the upper echelon, only 49%. That's really a low number. What did we see with like AFP's number, 70 or 80%, right? It could be a different respondents, but I don't think that's telling the story. So I think that this is really interesting to me, how we're starting to see the BEC number. I was always a little bit surprised that the BEC number wasn't, we weren't seeing that yet, right, in the survey results from the AFP and Craig's great team, but we're seeing that now. Again, payments fraud sources, just some more context there. Again, and here we go with, you know, the types of fraud that we're seeing. The BEC, right, 58%, just by the different exposures that we looked at. So just interesting to see like what those are. So let's go ahead and we're gonna sneak in another polling question here, and this kind of dovetails what John and I have been talking about. Just asking you to share with us if your colleagues and you involved in the AP function at your company, if you're well educated relative to payments fraud. Is that something you would say, yeah, I strongly agree with that, I somewhat agree to it, I somewhat disagree, I strongly disagree, or you might not know, right? So let's go ahead and leave that polling question up for another 10 seconds or so. I want to give John some time to really start doing a little bit of a deeper dive on those internal risk exposures that we talked about, which are of increasing importance. So I'm going to give you about 5 more seconds, then we'll take a quick peek, and I'll just give us a little color commentary, and then we'll dig a little bit deeper into the BEC, business email compromise side of fraud risk exposures. Let's go ahead and close the polling question. Go ahead and share the results. Pleasantly surprised to see that we have 67% of you that agree. So kudos to you. Somewhat disagree and strongly disagree and don't know. Well, we want to get you up to strongly agree. So there's a lot of things that can be done. I always say, if you offer food, they will come, right? Field of Dreams, if you build it, they will come. But if you offer food, they will also come. And so those of you, 16%, you say you don't know, you know what I'm going to say? Homework, right? But I don't think this is necessarily surprising, but obviously the goal is to get us to strongly agree. And those of you who strongly agree, I would love for you to send me a message on LinkedIn and tell me exactly the educational programs, the type of things that you're doing, because I think that would be useful knowledge to everyone in the Treasury and finance and risk management profession. So thank you for answering that question. And so again, we talked about the BEC fraud. So this just kind of shows this upward trend, right? Too much text on here. Bad me for doing that, but just a lot more context there. So again, happy to share the slides with you, but the main point here is that we have this upward trend and it's going to keep going on the BEC front. And so let's take a look at fraud prevention, how we do that. This is incredibly important just to see what other people are doing. And I would politely suggest to you, you should be doing all of these, in my opinion. So stronger internal controls, right? Internal controls, education and training. This is John and I are on that soapbox together, right? Implementing company policies and two-factor authentication. John, do you have any thoughts here or things you might want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the strong internal controls is a key piece here, right? BEC fraud is successful because something within the organization's policies or controls are allowing a payment to be released based on an email approval or, you know, what looks like an email approval, right? So, you know, strong internal controls in terms of making sure that those transactions are reviewed and that, you know, at least 2 sets of eyes are on all transactions are really important, I think, as well in preventing BEC.
Okay, great. Yeah, and just that separation of duties, right? That's what I want to keep us thinking about in that remote environment. How do we maintain that separation of duties and this dual approval, right? We might even have to change, right, our dual approval structure, and sometimes that takes the board, but we have to do what we can. And so just some more context, I made this point earlier, just another way to look at it. The point that we're making here is that everyone is going to experience fraud, and then you can get multiple instances of fraud regardless of your company size. For me, my Treasury horror story used to be, we made a lot of acquisitions, and a lot of, maybe more than once when we were kind of consolidating in an AP account from an acquisition, as we got down to the last few checks, we would see fraud. So what did that tell me? I think somebody internally at corporate somehow had a hand in what was going on there. But I mean, I've seen that firsthand. We had multiple, luckily we had things like positive pay. Look at that right there. What a great transition, right? I wasn't even thinking about that. So your fraud controls, right? Checks fraud is still incredibly important. Positive pay, we have reverse positive pay, payee positive pay. I'm dating myself. We didn't have this when I was Treasury manager. So for me, the things that I think are really powerful is obviously the positive pay, but the payee positive pay, anything that has positive pay in it, we're down for that. We should be doing that. And then the reconciliations here, this is incredibly important. What I mentioned before is what we often find is people don't know that fraud has occurred. And so we need to make sure that we know that as quickly as possible. John, anything stick out to you here?
Yeah, I mean, I think that reconciliation process is critical as well. You know, positive pay, I think, is an obvious one for all organizations. I'd be surprised, you know, that most don't have positive pay in place, you know, for check transactions, for check writing accounts. But that visibility aspect is really important, you know, to make sure somebody's actually reconciling those accounts and you know, proactively sort of identifying if anything is abnormal with those accounts as well is critical.
Yeah, the other thing I want to make note of is you can have things like positive pay in place, but people need to know the value of them. And so I had a personal experience where we had positive pay in process, and somebody was just in the mood to release all the exceptions because they thought they knew that it was a good transaction, and it wasn't. So we can have all the greatest tools in the world, but we need to also educate the people that use those tools and make sure they understand why it's important and hold them accountable for doing so. And we need to audit. We should be checking. I mean, after that incident happened, I would go in and look at those. It wasn't my direct responsibility. I would go in there every day and look at what was in there myself. And they just had my eye on it because I wanted to make sure it didn't happen again. Even though that wasn't, you know, wasn't my thing. I mean, I delegated that, but I just had to look at that every day. So, you know, here some of the same tools, right? When you look at fraud prevention, we see the same thing: reconcile daily accounts, separate accounts for electronic billing, debit block. I used to have arguments about this all the time. We had ACH debit block on across the board. Nobody got to debit our account. And so we had to make a few exceptions with tax and things with certain acquisitions, but that was my rule. Nobody gets to debit my account. Any thoughts here, John, on ACH fraud?
Yeah, so we had similar processes in place as well, where ACH debit blocks were implemented for most accounts, and then just certain transaction accounts that were set up specifically for, you know, transaction activities such as an ACH debit would have an ACH debit filter, an ACH positive pay in effect as well. But I think what you mentioned is pretty commonplace. You know, a lot of treasurers have that mentality of nobody is allowed to debit my account. In some instances, it seems like it's unavoidable, right? You know, you just have certain relationships in place where you need to have debitabilities on the accounts. And when you do, ACH positive pay is a great tool to have in place.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Here's corporate, commercial, and debit cards. I think we're going to start to see this number possibly creep up because we're starting to see some traction in the space that I like to call virtual and ghost cards. So nothing really earth-shattering there. It's just something that we need to be aware of. Measures taken against payments fraud in general. We've talked about these. Again, daily reconciliations. Oh, look at this. Ensure disaster recovery plans include ability to continue with strong controls. This number might be 100% next year, right? Because we had to deal with that. So let's go ahead. The importance of security principles. So this is kind of there's a lot going on here on this slide. So I'm going to go ahead and ask. I'm not going to try and go through this slide to be mindful of our time. Again, we have a lot of great content. I want to make sure I have some time for John. What controls do you have in place? Again, we talked about all these. You should all have all of these in place. Dual controls, firewall, data protection policies, data security, multi-factor, employee education, training at point of hire, annually, internal systems. So we should look at these, and these should all be close to 100%. That's my recommendation. And more on security methods, data security, bank and corporate, so encryption, biometrics, and so just kind of where we're going with the technology. Here's what we look at in terms of bank accounts being reconciled and visibility. So John did a great point of mentioning this. We have to have visibility. You can't manage what you can't see. You don't know what you don't know. In a related survey, we need to have visibility into our bank account activity every day. We need to be able to reconcile our accounts every day, and technology is allowing us to do that. So if you're not there yet, I just suggest that this is extremely important. So the point from this slide is you want visibility, you want that reconciliation. There's tools to do that. So let's just see how we can all get together and help make that happen. And we want to have a controls framework, right? You have to have a policy. It's got to be enforceable, right? And people have to know there's consequences to it. And so unfortunately, what we see is people don't have a formal policy or it's well understood. So we need to do a lot better as a Treasury profession here. And so we see little differences. North America is a little bit better, but the thing I would take away from this slide is we need to do a better job of formalizing our Treasury frauds and controls framework. Guess what? Now that we have a remote environment, you're all going to be asked to do this, and I think that's not a bad thing. Here's one of my favorite slides, training payoff. And so Craig had an amazing survey. So 70% train their employees on security annually. That's fantastic. I would agree. I would actually go a step further, train every employee, have a conversation about fraud, everyone in the payments process quarterly. And so just looking at the value, right, to investments, and so payment diversion fraud, kind of the value there, BAMC, so that you can start to see the value in investing in this education. Again, where you stand depends on where you sit, but I think this is really something to get someone's attention. Why do we want to invest on this? Look at this survey. If you're not doing it, 70% of people are doing it. We need to do this. This is best practices, and we're a best-in-class company, so we need best practices. Then we talked about areas of spend already. So let me go ahead and hand the floor over to John, because I really want him to spend a few minutes talking about these internal fraud exposures, because I don't think it gets the attention it deserves. John?
Yeah, thanks, Ernie. Yeah, and we looked at a lot of good survey results here, a lot of information about industry trends and things. And so we have another stat up on the screen here related to a recent AFP survey, which indicated that as much as 36% of the fraud threats actually came from internal sources. So when we're talking about internal fraud types, we're talking about common things like false forged checks, or the misuse of certain corporate cards that are issued by the organization. But even false payment requests, employees manipulating the payment systems and things like that to generate false vendors or false payment transactions internally. Even utilizing stolen credentials or exploiting certain technologies that are in place for the organization as well in terms of the payment process. And so you talk a lot about these external fraud threats here, and obviously the external fraudsters are becoming more and more sophisticated every single day, but there's also this big component of internal fraud risk as well that organizations really need to think about. And I think overall here, if we talk about if we flip the next slide here and talk about internal controls or just internal processes, right? And how do they really impact an organization? And we see really the biggest fraud risk coming from a lack of sufficient internal controls and overall weak processes. And I think we talked a lot about these topics already earlier in the webinar, but one person having too much control over a single process, not having that proper segregation of duties is a key weakness that you you can see that really results in excessive fraud risk for an organization. Decentralization, a lot of organizations' payment processes are pretty spread out, so they utilize multiple different applications. Obviously, most organizations are multi-bank, so having a process that's spread out like that is obviously difficult to manage. How do you maintain that visibility aspect that we talked about earlier, right, through the decentralized process? A lack of standardization, which really, I think, dovetails into the point prior, right? You can't really standardize a process consistently across an organization that's decentralized, and that standardization is so critical, I think, in terms of making sure that those controls are in place and, having a process that you can actually monitor and quickly identify things that are falling outside the normal transaction process. Likewise, that lack of transparency, right? Like Ernie mentioned, you can't manage what you can't see, really. So, if you don't have that transparency into your overall payment environment and what your payment transacting environment really looks like, there's a huge internal risk there as well. The manual burden, sort of this manual intervention aspect for employees within an organization. The more a file is able to be, it needs to be touched by the individuals within the organization versus just transacted through the technology. The bigger risk for fraud, really, anything can happen to that file from the time it leaves the ERP, if it's manually downloaded, to the time it is uploaded into an e-banking portal or another form of payment technology as well. And then overall, the misuse of technology, I think, is a big component as well, right? So really in two senses, in one, maybe organizations become too reliant on technology and think that it's backstopping processes, but overall, technology makes it convenient to transact, right? So it can really, present additional risk just because it makes it so easy to actually move funds. If you don't have these proper controls in place, prior to using technology, it doesn't really do you any good. So to stay on this technology topic here, so how does technology sort of effectively help an organization? I think that, and you think about technology in terms of, business intelligence tools and things like that, in our view, it doesn't need to be that complicated. Technology can really help an organization mitigate fraud through helping them, sort of steering them into Treasury best practices, right? So an effective technology tool can help you standardize the process, like we mentioned on the previous slide. Becomes difficult to do when your payment process is really spread out. Likewise, the centralization, right? So really combining all of these payment applications in one place and giving you sort of one centralized process to manage across your entire organization. The automation piece goes hand in hand with that in terms of limiting the amount of human intervention in that process as well. And the interoperability piece, that really facilitates the whole thing. If the technology solution is able to integrate with your back office systems and then also your bank, that's sort of the straight through processing environment that you want, and if it can connect with all systems, then that's where you really get this standardization and centralization that make the overall oversight of the process much, much easier and really help you to eliminate fraud, right? And then this last bullet point here, obviously, the availability, this business continuity aspect that's really coming into focus right now with the coronavirus crisis right now, and a lot of organizations realizing that, even if they have the most secure processes in place, that process needs to be able to continue during abnormal times as well. So to get a little bit more specific about it, the benefits that a technology provider should really be offering you is this real-time transparency, right, over your accounts, balance, and transactions. This is that visibility piece, right? So most organizations realize that if they have all their activity in one place and they have a clear way to oversee it and see everything in one central place, then it's easy to quickly recognize anything that's abnormal, anything that falls outside the norm. And so that alone is an enormous benefit in combating fraud, obviously. Straight through processing, like we mentioned before, is best practice for bulk payments, for AP payments. Really, when you have a process as big as the AP process, straight through processing really becomes the only way to make sure that that process is really under control, right? Because with an enormous volume of transactions, you sort of have to rely on this straight through process, this hands-off, automated process to make sure that things are under control so that you can evaluate the process as a whole. Segregation of duties we've mentioned a couple times as well is absolutely key, and an effective Treasury technology solution will guide you into these workflows and these segregation of duties, and really make sure that all of your processes for transacting and even transacting at different levels are secure and have all the right checks and balances in place as well. I think the data integrity piece is key as well. The statement reporting coming back, being able to clearly identify where that came from, what day it's from, knowing that you're looking at the most recent balance for all of your accounts, and that that data came directly over from the bank, and that data is reliable is important as well. We talk to a lot of organizations that are pretty spread out, and they might be receiving balance information reporting, word of mouth sort of from foreign subsidiaries and things based on reporting it that way, and then it becomes difficult to really rely on that data and know that it's accurate. And then lastly here, just this signature and bank account specific rights management topic, right? So who are the individuals that have signing authority over these bank accounts? Who has the ability to transact here on these bank accounts as well? What are really the privileges that are in place for all individuals, from transacting through view only, through even being able to see certain confidential details of the bank accounts as well. So these are all components I think make up an effective technology solution.
All right, thank you so much, John, for that tremendous insight and the deep dive there. Again, internal risk exposures are incredibly important. So here's your business case for paying more attention to payments fraud. Any CFO will be happy after they hear this, and they will be engaged. So payments fraud is rampant. Your company is at risk. Your company writes checks. Your company uses email. Your company has people-related exposures, process and technology. Fraud schemes are constantly evolving. Your exposures grow as your business grows, and fraudsters do fraud all day, every day. A few tips for avoiding payments fraud. Again, I think John did a fantastic job in that in the previous slides. We need that visibility. We need that cash flow transparency. We want that standardized payments process. We don't want manual payments, and we want that strict and verifiable audit trails. Again, the single user end-to-end. We need to have those limits, separation of duties, limit the re-input of data, and then using those filtering and flagging techniques. And then just to continue with our theme of giving you very specific information, kind of the bottom line, educating each employee involved in payments processing is extremely important. I recommend doing that every quarter. You want to leverage technology as supplier portals, minimize risk. You want to leverage technology that optimizes end-to-end payments, technology that automates invoice to payment flow, technology that automates internal and external controls and policy compliance. Technology is not magic, but it enables best practices. Minimize the number of people and systems that are involved in the payments process. So I'm going to go ahead and launch our final polling question as I go ahead and wrap things up with some closing comments. So first of all, I want to once again thank our webinar partner today, TIS. We appreciate their long relationships with Treasury webinars in delivering thought leadership and really supporting the Treasury and finance professions. Those of you that listen to my webinars, you will know that I have some of the most interesting and thought-provoking webinars with my partners from TIS, and it's been a pleasure to have my first webinar with John. Hopefully much more to come. So John, I want to thank you for being with us today and sharing your insights. So thank you so much, John.
Yeah, thank you as well, Ernie. Thanks very much for having us.
And also go ahead and leave the polling question up for another 10 seconds or so. And just want to also mention it, even more relevant here in the environment that we're in. Treasury Webinars is working with several key partners, including TIS. We are going to deliver the first ever Treasury and Finance virtual conference. So I know a lot of you have experienced your conferences are being canceled. And so we have been thinking about this for the last year. And so we have the best partners in place. We have the best technology in place. So I encourage you to join the forum with myself and TIS. And again, before I let everyone go, I want to thank again our webinar partner today, TIS, and to you, the audience. Thank you so much for your valuable time and trusting us. with your time in these challenging times. Stay healthy, stay safe, and make the rest of your day great, everyone.